Today, as we talk about environment and climate change, I'd just like to invite everyone to reflect on how we can foster relationships with this environment in a way that is respectful and considerate. So today's session title is Climate Change Impacts Here and There, What We Can Do Here and Now. So earlier this year, we had our first global affairs session on climate, and we had a guest who was able to talk a little bit about some of the issues that we're facing today and some of the threats of climate change and how they're becoming more prevalent as time goes on. So today we are going to address some ways that we can help tackle the issue of climate change, and we're going to hear some really amazing perspectives from some very knowledgeable speakers. Today we have Dr. Andrew Weaver and two of our own Pearson alumni, including World Wildlife Fund member Lilian Marquez and Maldives Minister of Environment Shauna Aminath. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Andrew Weaver, who is a professor in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences at the University of Victoria and was also the Canada Research Chair in Climate Modeling and Analysis before he became the leader of the BC Green Party. He has co-authored over 200 peer-reviewed papers on various climate sciences and has 2 published books on the topics of climate change and global warming. In addition, he was a member of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, which was awarded a joint Nobel Prize in 2007. So Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Ocean Sciences. But prior to that, I spent 8 years in the BC legislature, where I was also the MLA for Oak Bay Gordon Head, representing Oak Bay Gordon Head in the BC legislature, and the leader of the BC Green Party, which was a party that held the balance of power for 3 years in our minority government here in British Columbia. So I'm going to be talking from both hats. And why I raised this issue here is that I hired over the years a number of people to work in the legislature. Now, as a scientist at the University of Victoria, my secret to success, I would always argue, is to find the very smartest people I could as grad students, surround myself with them and protect them from all the nonsense that is out there that would otherwise stop them from doing their good things, and let them be free to be creative. Well, guess what I did in the legislature? The same idea, and guess where those people came from? I'll throw that as a question. I had 4 people from, okay, I'll tell you. My criteria for employment in the Ledge was you graduated from United Worlds College. So I had a fellow called Aldous Spurl, who graduated from Pearson, Taylor Hartrick graduated from Pearson, Kaylee, and now I think she might have been from the Adriatic School, and Alicia, whose name I forgot, was from Atlantic, I think, as well. So the reason why is that I found that the people who graduated from the Pearson or UWC IB program were second to none in terms of their ability to see a pathway through the morass of challenges to find the opportunities or those golden nuggets on which to advance public policy and the betterment of our society. So it was really a rewarding time for me. But I'm glad to be out because it's politics is tough. Anyway, so what is the problem? Well, we all know what the problem is. Would you like me to talk directly into this?
Zoom people?
Yeah.
Sorry,
I'm getting zoomed here.
you need to share your desktop because the program isn't.
Share my desktop. I don't share my desktop. I don't like doing that.
But it's only sharing your slides.
Okay. Okay. That's good. We good now? Okay, so let me move the chat away. So the problem is, of course, the world is warming. We know that despite the fact that 40% of US Republicans believe that there's not strong evidence that the earth is warming, we've got instruments measuring the Earth's temperature for many, many decades to centuries. And in fact, believing that the world is not warming is akin to not believing in the existence of thermometers. So it's outrageous, but it's clear what's going on. And we know that the world is warming year after year after year, and that in the warmest year on record was 2016 and 2020 before that, and on and on and on. So this is the challenge. By itself, what's the degree? Nobody really doesn't really mean much to us, but I'll try to explain why it's of concern. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about what I did, but my background in the field of climate is I was involved as a lead author in the second, third, fourth, and fifth IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessments. And my expertise was in the building of instruments, particular Earth system computer models, to explore the various feedbacks and interactions of the various components of the climate system. One of the things we looked at, for example, it's a big issue, is the issue of permafrost carbon feedback. A question we could ask is this: what happens if everybody immediately turned all emissions of greenhouse gases off immediately in 2013? What would happen to the atmosphere? And that's shown here: atmospheric CO2 on the y-axis and years on the x-axis. And there's 3 lines here for 3 different numbers. Now, in the field of climate science, the single most important metric, quantifying our collective understanding of the science and physics and all the feedbacks of the climate system, is something known as climate sensitivity. That number is essentially this: how much will the world warm if we double atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from 280 to 560 parts per million? That's the climate sensitivity. So what we could do with this model is kind of change that a little bit and use that as a parameter that we're going to explore what's the permafrost carbon feedback under some different climate sensitivities. That is, how sensitive is the climate system to a perturbation in atmospheric carbon dioxide? Well, if you, best estimates at the time were somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. So if the climate sensitivity of our real world was 2 degrees, you'd have the dotted line. If it's 4.5 degrees, you'd have the solid line. And what is climate sensitivity again? The amount the world would warm if you double atmospheric carbon dioxide. There's uncertainty into scientific understanding of that. So in the permafrost carbon feedback analysis we did, we said, okay, we're going to turn all emissions off in 2013 if the climate sensitivity is 2 degrees. Well, great. The natural sinks in the climate system start to draw down the carbon naturally over the time period of many, many, many centuries to millennia. If the climate sensitivity is 3, it kind of stays constant. And if the climate sensitivity is higher, we see that even if all emissions were turned off immediately everywhere in the world, we still warm a little bit as a direct consequence of the fact that there's some inertia in the melting of the permafrost that continues to add atmospheric loading of carbon dioxide. It's small, but it's not insignificant. So that's the kind of, that's my expertise in the climate system. So I come from the physics side of the climate problem, and I ended up in the politics side for reasons that I'll get to in a second. So I've always believed, for example, that as scientists, we have a duty and a responsibility to communicate our science, which is largely funded by the taxpayer, and science that is not effectively communicated is frankly ineffective science. And if you discover the cure for cancer, but you can't tell anybody about it and you don't know how to explain it or have it reproducible, you're obviously not going to be actually doing very important science because nobody can repeat it. So I've always believed that as a society, we need to move beyond what is happening, particularly in North America and certain other Western democracies, is a move towards this populist, decision-based, evidence-making approach to governance. And we need more of a return to what I would suggest has been prevalent and does exist in most European nations still, particularly those that employ a form of proportional representation, is one where policy flows from evidence rather than evidence being used after the fact to justify policy. That is, in Canada and in North America, we see an awful lot of decision-based evidence making. We make a decision and then we find the evidence and the validators to justify a decision that we've already made, rather than saying, what does the evidence say we should decide? And here's why I raise that as an issue. I'm going to summarize all of climate change science into one figure with 8 panels from the 5th assessment report. The 8 panels are in 2 columns. The first column is showing the average global temperature over the decades 2016 to 2035. And the second column is 2081 to 2100. And what is shown here is 5 different scenarios of future emissions. That is, we know that any change in the future is going to be driven as a direct consequence of future emissions. So we have to make some socioeconomic assumptions of those, and those are illustrated through what are called RCP 2.6, 6, 4.5, and 2.6, 8.5, 6.0, and 4.5. In essence, this is a relatively benign emissions trajectory growth, a little bit more growth, and this is the pathway we're presently on. And why I put this up is that if you look at this, you see that in the first column, between 2016 and 2013, they all look the same. They all have about 0.5 degrees globally warming relative to the decades 1986 to 2005 in all three panels. But look at the difference as we get to the end of the century, depending on the policy pathways we follow, or what I mean in also is depending on the decisions that are made today. And here I would argue is the single greatest conundrum and challenge for the dealing with of global warming, and the issue that is entirely within our grasp to solve. It is political barriers. And why I say that is that when you look at this, you realize that the entire question of global warming as a society, whether or not we should deal with it, boils down to one question. And the question is this: do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of the environment we leave behind, yes or no? It's as simple as that. If yes, then we have to act now, because the decisions we make today are really insensitive, that what's going to happen in the next couple of decades is really insensitive to those decisions, and hence the decision makers who make those decisions. But what happens as the century progresses profoundly is determined upon the decisions we make today, and hence the political conundrum. In the political sphere, we often find four-year electoral cycles, and in the decision-making process in politics, you find that year one is when the difficult decisions get made, and year three is where you start to making really easy decisions that will get you reelected. And so what you end up finding too is that a lot of people unfortunately go into politics and think it's a job. And when you think it's a job, you start to worry about losing your job. And so you start to put in place policy measures to ensure you get reelected rather than to do perhaps what's right. So a decision by a leader today who might take very aggressive steps to advance climate policy is one who will actually not ever see the consequences of the policies they've enacted, because the ramifications of those policies play out as the century progresses. And this is the conundrum, because if you go into any election in North America, you will find at election time an awful lot of campaigning until this last Canadian federal election, which we'll come to, is always about things like reducing hip and knee replacement lineups. And of course, because at the election comes around, you can point to the, a seniors demographic of which 80% vote and say, look, we're going to listen to you. We're going to reduce those lineups. You do that, throw some money at it. When you get 4 years later, you say, look, I did what I said, vote me back in. I responded. 4-year time frame made a real difference in someone's life. More difficult to say, I'm going to put aggressive carbon pricing in, and then 100 years from now, your children will be thankful because it's got part of a pathway down towards where we're heading. And of course, in doing so, I'm going to run into an awful lot of vested interests who will resist that change. So it's a very, very challenging problem from a policy perspective. So why do we care? Like, who cares about global warming? Why should we care? I would argue there's two main reasons, assuming that we care about intergenerational equity. And I suspect, looking at the average age profile of the person in the room here, that intergenerational is equity that probably is something you care about, and frankly, your parents and grandparents probably care about too. And the reason why, there's the two main ramifications, impacts of global warming. No, the world is not going to end. Yes, life will go on. No, it's not, we're not going to have tens of millions of people dying in the streets. That's not, despite the hyperbole that some, it's very, very serious problem for two main reasons. One is the rate of change of climate is unparalleled in the history of most of the species that exist on our planet, and many of them have a difficulty in adapting to the rapidity of the change. So widespread species extinction is one. Other species will evolve down the road. Life will go on. I mean, we as humans are really nothing more than gnats on the surface of the earth, and whether we're here to nurture that life forward is another thing. The other thing is geopolitical instability, and this is an issue of global equity, because the problem has happened and is a direct consequence of emissions historically being done by developed world, yet the implications and ramifications of those decisions that were historically made for the advancement of Western democracies have impacted disproportionately on those who do not have the economic wherewithal to actually adapt to the change. So you can imagine if you're from Sudan or sub-Saharan Africa and you're seeing the increased desert certification and water drying up, that you might point blame not at yourself, but at those who have created the conditions that have led to the desert certification and the inability of you to inhabit your own land, and you might get kind of feisty about that. So geopolitical instability is another serious concern. Can someone guide me on the timing? So how Oh, good. Okay, so here's how have political leaders responded. There's a figure of years from 1750 to today and gigatons of emissions, and essentially they haven't. I mean, let's be blunt. It's been pathetic. It's really been nothing more than pathetic. That's the best I can do. And this agreement, which you hear many people trumpet, is frankly pathetic as well, because it cannot work right now until this key issue is dealt with. The Paris Agreement is destined to fail unless we can get a handle on what are known as border tax adjustments. And why this is the problem is, and we'll come to that, I won't discuss it now, but I will come to that perhaps in questions. A border tax adjustment is this, is that let's suppose I'm a nation that is really committed to decarbonizing, and I'm going to go all in on carbon pricing, and I have a vivid apple. Anyone from New Zealand here? Okay, awesome. Okay, New Zealand, Southern Hemisphere, they grow a lot of apples. Let's suppose you have a rogue conservative coal baron who's your prime minister in New Zealand. You don't, but you have historically, but they don't. They have a very progressive leader. And this progressive coal baron has decided that New Zealand is going to go, it just doesn't care about global warming. And BC is very progressive, and we do. So what we're going to do is put in a very aggressive carbon tax, and we're going to make people who pollute pay. We're going to find that those Okanagan apple growers who want to keep their fruit fresh for the off season are going to have a carbon tax if they're not exempted for the natural gas used to keep their product cool for the off season. Now, New Zealand over there, I'm sorry to point to you, I'm not blaming you, but New Zealand over there with their coal baron prime minister, who's not, but because they have a very progressive woman who's prime minister, he might say, okay, you know what, let's go dump our apples over in BC because we're not paying a carbon tax, so we can sell those apples in BC where they're internalizing that pollution externality. We can undercut their market and sell them cheap. So the consumer goes out and buys their apples, and they're buying New Zealand apples while the orchard apples from the Okanagan aren't getting bought because they're too expensive because they're paying a carbon tax. That is the kind of inequity that can arise from things unless you allow a jurisdiction to put on its border the equivalent of carbon tax on products coming from jurisdictions that aren't taking steps forward. But of course, as soon as you do that, you run into anti-dumping legislations, international trade barriers got put up, and you cannot do it. You get taken to the World Trade Court. So this, to me, is the single biggest issue that the world is facing in the lead up to the upcoming COP, is getting agreement on border tariff adjustments, because without this, there is one country will always be competing against another, and there are some hopes that we're going there. I'm going to conclude with solutions at the end, but I want you to know that please don't get hung up about this nonsense about 1.5 degrees. We can't stop 1.5 degrees. The world's warmed by 1.1 degrees. We have 0.2 degrees from permafrost carbon feedback and 0.6 degrees warming if we just equilibrate to existing levels of greenhouse gases. So in actual fact, we're all hands on deck for 3 degrees, but that's okay. 3 degrees means that there's a big change. But it's a change that one can adapt to, and you cannot even talk about an adaptation strategy unless you understand what you're adapting to, and the change is big. I'm just going to try to rapidly get to the end here and say I was involved in the IPCC 2013 assessment. This was the 4th one I was involved with. This 1,000-page volume can be summarized in a grand total of 7 words. You can imagine how frankly depressing it is to be writing papers on all of this. You know, I talked about climate sensitivity. Jules Charney, the very first national assessment of what the climate sensitivity was, that single most important metric. And in 1979, in that assessment, they came up with 1.5 to 4.5 degrees as the best estimate. And look at these years, the IPCC assessments, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. We're now at the 5th IPCC assessment in 2013. I graduated high school in 79. We're 35 years later, and the single most important metric hasn't changed, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. It has now, it's a little tighter, but you can imagine I could either sit around at that point and start, playing with more equations and coming up with more climate sensitivity between 1.5 and 4 degrees, or you could do what I argue has been done, because we don't need more science to tell us what the problem is. It's really the barriers are political. The politicians are not doing theirs. We can all sit around and complain about it, but that's not the style for the Pearson College kind of UWC grads. And so I would encourage you instead, get engaged with our democratic system to try to change it and make a difference, because now the time is actually right. We know that the solutions are all there. They fit in three categories: technological behavior and what I call market instruments. So you could think of this as a regulatory environment, and that is exactly what the role of government is. The role of government is three: to enable one to occur on a fair and level playing field, and that two happens in a means and ways that proper education is out there, so people actually know what they're getting themselves into. And I'm going to illustrate that quickly with a classic TOK kind of tragedy of the commons. I told you nobody likes TOK. They laughed as soon as I said it. I was being challenged that everyone at Pearson loves TOK. And I know for a fact that my son did TOK, and he didn't like TOK. So I'm sorry to the TOK teachers out there. They're going to get very upset at me after this. But anyway, tragedy of the commons. I just had to listen to TOK stories at my house a lot. So let's suppose hypothetically, I'm going to do this quickly, and then I'm going to end with it'll be 2 minutes. Tragedy of the commons. We all know this. You would have probably covered this in TOK. Have you covered this in TOK? Econ, even better, because now I can use the language of internalizing externalities, and you covered that, right? There we go. Beautiful. So we're going to do the analogy here with the climate problem. So we have the cows, of course, the tragedy of the commons. The farmers are doing a cost-benefit analysis. Should I put a cow in this pasture, or should I not? Well, cost-benefit analysis, the benefit of putting a cow entirely reaped by me, costs of overgrazing distributed amongst everyone. So when I do a cost-benefit analysis, it's always to my advantage to put a cow on this land, and there is only one equilibrium solution, which is an eventual collapse through overgrazing, as every farmer does the same thing. So what do? You have to somehow recognize that there's a cost associated with your behavior, and that is a cost of overgrazing. So you might, for example, elect a council. This is the government setting the regulatory environment, the market instruments. And the government might do one of two things. They might regulate the number of cows, or perhaps they might say, we're going to cap the number of cows allowed on this land, and we're going to let the market determine the price to put a cow on the land, and we're going to have cow certainty. We're not going to have cow certainty, but we're going to have cow certainty. We're going to know how many cows we're going to allow. We're going to auction off the permits and let the market control the price, and pull back or release more permits depending on how many cows are on. Or we could put a head tax on each cow and do the same thing. We have price certainty here. We don't have cow certainty. And in both of these cases, what we're saying is there's an externality, a cost associated with what you're doing. And if you want to put that cow on the lawn, you better pay that cost. And in this case, we get a bit of money. And what do? Maybe we could build some fences, buy some fertilizer, and we could use that for the betterment of everyone. The analogy to climate system is direct. Flagship policy must be in place, not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Flagship policy is carbon pricing, internalizing the externality, either through cap and trade, regulatory, or carbon taxes. And the reason why is it is in every single person's interest, in every house, in every municipality, in every town, in every province, in every city, in every province, in every country, in the world's best interest to do nothing, because the costs of action are borne by the individual and the costs of inaction are distributed amongst 8 billion people in the next generation. We've had wireless technology since I was in high school. Internet, you've all got laptops. We've put men on the moon. We could put women on the moon, for heaven's sake. We send billionaires up to space just for fun. Yet things like this, the internal combustion engine, have remained very unchanged in a very long time. And you can think about this. I'm not going to talk about it. Think about what are the reasons why explosions and pistons moving up and down is still the predominant means of transporting people. And with all this technological innovation, we're still there. Is it because we lack innovative capacity? No. And you can think about the vested interests. So I'm going to finish up just by showing this, because I'm always asked three things. What can people do about global warming? And I always say there's three things you could do. One is we all have a wallet. When you buy something, you're sending a signal to the market as to what the values are that are important to you. You can change that. Organic food sections in groceries did not exist when I was a child. Now, you wouldn't have a grocery store without one. It's because of consumer demand moving down that pathway. The second thing everyone can do is vote. Some of you are probably not quite there yet, but almost all of you can. And the reason why I say that is I've tried to frame the whole issue of global warming as to one of intergenerational equity. Yet look at the Canadian youth engagement in our electoral system. For me, I couldn't care less about global warming, because no matter what I do, no matter what any of you do, no matter what anyone does in the policy realm anywhere, I'm 59. It's not going to affect me. What's going to happen is in the cards. So I'm going to be voting for my hip and knee replacements. All 80% of me seniors who are not seniors, we're coming up voting for our hip and knee replacements. And here's the youth, less than 50% showing up at the polls. So is there any wonder why the elected leadership is actually putting in place policy measures that are catering to the people who they know are voting and not to the youth? You can ask yourself, who's at fault there? And I would suggest number 3 solution that we have, which is education. Each and every one of us can tell everybody we know about 1 and 2. And it's not about a political party, it's about the policy. And we started to see that federally in this last election in Canada. So finally, climate change, in my view, is actually the single greatest opportunity for innovation and creativity the world has ever seen. You know, every environmental challenge, you can see those challenges through the lens of fear, hopelessness, and chaos, or you could see those through the challenge of the opportunity for innovation. And when you look at the great advances in human history, going back several 100,000 years to the onset of our first ancestors, you find that the great steps forward in human ingenuity have often been associated with dramatic challenges, and in some cases, climate challenges for our early modern ancestors. So rather than in dwelling on the hopelessness, I like to focus on the excitement of finding solutions. And I'm not going to talk about the solutions, but just point up to say that we know what they are in BC. 40% of our emissions from transportation. Talk about low-hanging fruit in BC. There we have it. And finally, I'll say why I have more hope than I've ever had. It's because of the incredible work of Greta Tunberg, who, without anyone from Sweden here. Pardon? Your name's not Greta, obviously. No, but what Greta has done here is this innocent young woman was able to galvanize support for public pressure on our political establishment. And that has had more effect, I would argue, than any other single person ever in the history of climate policy. And I certainly believe she is deserving of a Nobel Peace Prize for her works in this area. And, you know, she's been down here as well. But one of the problems I've noticed, and I'll leave this with you, is as somebody who spent 8 years in politics, activism is important. We have to know what you don't like. But if you really want to be effective, if you really want to make a difference, don't just tell people what you don't like. Tell them what you would do instead. And why I say that is I can tell you, some of you might know the Simpsons here. If all we do is shout at the clouds and say what we don't like, that's fine. But most of the people making the very difficult decisions have no idea what to do. Help them. Help them help you by informing them what you would do and doing so in a manner that allows them to embrace the solutions you bring forward. And with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I went too long.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrew. So now I'd like to invite Benoit to introduce our next speaker. So he's up on Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Any sign? Okay, I'll take that, that you're listening to me. Our next speaker is in fact an alumna of Pearson College. She is from year 16, graduated in 1991. She is Dr. Lilian Marquez. She's a forestry engineer from the Universidad del Valle de Guatemala and has a PhD in public policy from Indiana University, where she studied under the supervision of Nobel laureate, Dr. Eleanor Ostrom. Lillian's been associated with the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, WWF, since 2008. Her current position is Design and Impact Officer for the Mesoamerica Regional Office in Central America. Previously, she worked with the United Nations Development Program. She's consulted with the World Bank, with the Rainforest Alliance, and the Ministry of Natural Resources in Guatemala. She's also been a research associate at the University of Texas and the Universidad del Valle de Guatemala. Interestingly, in 2014, Lillian took a sabbatical from her profession to teach environmental systems and societies at Mahindra United World College of India for 1 year. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy viewing her presentation, which she pre-recorded, but she's also with us online and will be able to answer your questions later.
Good afternoon. I am deeply honored to have been asked to speak to you today. My commitment to environmental challenges was born at Pearson College. In fact, I am responsible for food composting at Pearson. We began composting during my second year, thanks to a grant that a classmate and I received from the Johann Aschenbach Fund and WWF. With the grant, we built the first food composting system at Pearson. You probably don't know who Johann Aschenbach is, but he was one of us. Unfortunately, he passed away young, and his family established a series of environmental grants for UWC students. There is a plaque in his honor at Race Rocks. Check it out next time you're there. I would like to begin my remarks today with a memory from my Pearson days, more than 30 years ago. A few weeks after we arrived at Pearson, we had some gala dinner. I can't recall the reason for it, but I remember very, very well what we had for dinner. We had salmon. Like everything in those first few weeks, perhaps really that entire first year at Pearson, everything was an adventure. And I remember very well that I took my first bite of salmon with all the expectation of something completely new to me. The vibrant flesh, a color I would have never imagined a meat could have. The distinctively oily, fishy flavor was so unique. I enjoyed every bit of it. I had never had salmon before. I didn't know enough of the species to know that it was particular to the Pacific Northwest and that it was considered a delicacy, a luxury item. I remember writing home about it, and I'm pretty sure that I can count with my fingers of one hand how many times I had salmon during my 2 years there. It was a treat, a special meal. And for a working class girl from Guatemala, it was a symbol of how radically my life had changed when arriving at Pearson. At the end of my 2 years, despite having secured places and a scholarship to two North American universities, I made a decision to return to Guatemala. I wanted to give back as much as I could from the transformative and extraordinarily marvelous experience I had the privilege to live. I did not have salmon again for a very long time. And then suddenly I found myself invited to smoke salmon carpaccio at a gathering. And slowly but surely, salmon started to appear in the supermarket and in menus in Guatemala. I would like to think that the salmon is still a special treat at Pearson, but I'm also sure that less of you had the experience I had. In 30 years, salmon has gone from a luxury item and a local delicacy to a worldwide commodity that the middle class eats for lunch on a weekday. Salmon has been globalized, and the salmon that you have had on a weekday dinner at home is more than likely no longer fished, but farmed. The commodification of salmon illustrates what is wrong with the world that we have built. The current economic model makes everyone feel entitled to anything they wish for. And we have done so at the expense of the planet. We are destroying our home, the one planet that can host life as we know it, and very importantly, as we enjoy it. We know the current system is broken. We know it does not sustain life on Earth adequately, but we are unwilling to step away from it. From politicians' empty promises and corporations lobbying against changing our economic model, to all of us not willing to give up the luxuries of the middle class. The crisis we face is global and requires massive and immediate action at a scale that the great majority of us do not control. But there are actions that we can take as individuals. Our excessive meat consumption, our hunger for traveling and seeing every corner of the world, and having every comfort possible while we're at it, our desire to shop endlessly for stuff. They are all wrong. I have been working on climate change for more than 25 years. My undergraduate thesis was the first ever carbon sequestration inventory in the country. And I was also part of the team that prepared Guatemala's first national communication to the UNFCCC, the UN Conference on Climate Change. Back in the day, I remember feeling so excited for the systemic change that had to be coming. The science was clear and there was clarity on what needed to be done. Decades later, I am devastated that we are in front of catastrophe, a catastrophe that I naively thought we could and we would prevent. I'm sorry for painting such a horrible scenario. Unfortunately, it is not the result of my imagination or my pessimistic tendencies. It is happening in every corner of this incredible planet we call home. We must act now, and it is my wish that we may do so with compassion for the poorest and most vulnerable of our sisters and brothers, and that we may recognize that nature is not only our ally, but that its protection and restoration must come even before ours. Our life, let alone our survival, depend entirely on nature, on the oxygen produced, on the water that is recycled and filtered, on the fertile soils that grow food. Our current system is deficient. It is unable to provide a livable future. We are all in this together. The necessary steps involve massive system change, and as individuals, we're not in control of that. But that does not mean we don't change our expectations, our behavior, our own choices. We must demand that politicians and corporations take action now. We must stop relying on fossil fuels. We must change our aspirations on what success and a good life mean. Every 2 years, WWF publishes the Living Planet report. You can find it online, and I highly recommend that you read it. The report is the collaboration of 3 science-based organizations, and sadly, the report finds what most other scientists are saying. The planet is in trouble, and we are to blame for it. However, the report is also very clear that we have the tools to revert some of the damage. We can still bend the curve. A group of scientists modeled different possible scenarios to show us the way forward. The thick yellow line that you see is the best possible scenario. And this scenario is where we come together and implement a series of integrated solutions that address both demand and supply improvements to how we use natural resources. The solution is in our hands. We must act now. It is in our best interest. Some of you may know that Central America is among the most vulnerable places in the world when it comes to the impact of the climate crisis. Our vulnerability is partly due to our geography, but more importantly, our vulnerability is by human design. Central America has been ruled to keep the majority poor, uneducated, unhealthy, and powerless. We have some of the largest percentages of population living under the poverty line. The inequality is terribly high. Unfortunately, these statistics are not getting better, they're getting worse. So when extreme weather events hit, they hurt the great majority of our population, the poor, with all their force and devastation. We are facing a biodiversity and a climate crisis, but nature can help us solve it. In Central America, WWF is working on identifying nature-based solutions to the impacts of climate change. Our work focuses on the Caribbean coasts of Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. This ecoregion is known as the Mesoamerican Reef. It is the second largest barrier reef in the world. You can see the map that it is not only a coastal marine scenario, but an integrated landscape that recognizes the connectivity of land and marine systems. This incredible ecosystem is a World Heritage Site recognized by UNESCO for its incredible, diverse, and rich biodiversity. It is a unique system worth protecting. Unfortunately, the reef is suffering enormously from increased ocean temperature and acidification, and other human-related stressors, including overfishing and pollution. WWF is working to try and reduce the impact of these stressors on the reef. We're committed to this because of the reef's inherent value, but also because it provides critical ecosystem services for coastal communities. Healthy habitats offer livelihoods to coastal communities and protects them from increasingly frequent extreme weather events. Our work includes various scales. We work with governments, offering them science-based evidence that can help them make the right decisions. In collaboration with Columbia and Stanford universities, we're modeling future scenarios to understand impact and find the best options for adaptation. We also work with local communities. The model scenarios that we developed were done in collaboration with the local communities who experienced impacts firsthand and who are also the most important conservation allies. Their livelihoods are directly linked to the use of natural resources. Their connection to nature makes them the best conservationists. Another example of our work in the region is with jaguars. The largest feline in America is rapidly losing its habitat, its food source, and even its access to water. Increased temperatures, longer dry seasons, and drought are adding pressure to an already threatened species. To help jaguars withstand the impact of increased temperatures, we're currently looking for funding to establish artificial watering holes in known jaguar territories. These are just two examples from the work that many of us around the world are carrying out in our struggle to protect humans and nature. When news of planetary catastrophe get to me, I turn to nature, to the fantastic work that WWF and others do every day for conservation, for a more respectful relationship with nature. And I pray that we may get it right. The challenge ahead is a tough one, but there is a way forward. The science is clear. We already know what we need to do to bend the curve, to remedy some of the damage, and to find a way to slowly restore nature's capacity to sustain life on Earth. There is a lot of work that needs to happen at the political global level, and we all need to be engaged. Raise our voices, demand action. But we must also act accordingly in our own private life, in our social life, in our political life. A lot has changed since I was at Pearson. For example, Guatemalan students now frequently come home for Christmas. Some of you even fly somewhere for travel week. In my time, it was forbidden for anyone to fly home during travel week. And Christmas was the time when our Canadian classmates invited all of those of us that couldn't go home. Our travel footprint was much smaller back then. The rationale was not greenhouse gas emissions, but a commitment to ensuring that none of us showed greater wealth than the poorest of us. It was part of our philosophy. You could start today, right now, by questioning the size of your footprint. You can take action both personally and as a community. Your collective actions should focus on improvements that can be made in your personal behavior, in your community behavior, and also in how you demand action from those leading the way. Half of you are on your second year, thinking about university and your future. Most of you will choose to stay in North America or Europe to go to college. If our alumni trends continue what they were a few years ago, many of you will choose professions that will bring you an affluent lifestyle. You can go ahead and choose a profession that you love and stay in the Western world with a larger footprint. I'm not questioning your choices. What I'm trying to say is, I want to ask you not to lose sight of what is important. Please remember that we depend on a healthy planet, one where humans and nature can thrive. That planet is not compatible with the aspirations that the current system says that privileged middle-class citizens of the world can have. Generations before you have traveled the world and acquired all types of luxuries like there was an unlimited supply. This is not true. It was never true. And we must stop believing it is, or that it is someone else's problem to fix it. As you can see, I do eat salmon. Definitely not for a weekday lunch. Back in 1991, I made the choice to come home, and it was not an easy choice. I remember feeling heartbroken because my choice meant that the amazing new world that I had known would end. I would go back to a society where I did not feel at home. But I did it because I wanted to give back where it was most needed. It has been challenging working on environmental issues when I know government after government will do anything in their power to mine, plunder, burn nature, and make sure that the majority remains poor and vulnerable. Still, every day I know that I am part of the solution, and my impact, as little as it may be, is what I need to do. Wherever you choose to go after Pearson, give it your best shot for the planet, for this extraordinary place that hosts such a rich, beautiful, and extraordinary life. Thank you very much for this chance. It has been a great honor for me to share with you today. And I look forward to our conversation afterwards.
Thank you very much, Lillian, and we will hear from you later. You're on the call right now. Yes, now I am to introduce another of our alumnae. She has made a different choice than that of Lillian, who chose education, advocacy, civil society to make those changes. As it turns out, our next guest has made the choice of politics and has voted her expression. Her Excellency Shauna Aminath is the Maldives Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Technology. Prior to her appointment recently, she served as Policy Secretary to His Excellency President Soli. During the former Nasheed administration, Shauna served as Undersecretary at the Policy Office, where she led the nation's vision of becoming a carbon neutral country by 2020, steering the development of the Maldives Renewable Energy Investment Plan. She was also responsible for communications between the President and local and international media. Shauna is an alumna of Pearson UWC from year 29, class of 2004. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, Environmental Science, and Economics from Westminster College in Missouri. She started her career as a journalist at Minivan News in 2008, covering the Maldives' first multi-party presidential election. And from 2010 to 14, she was president of the Maldivian Democratic Party's youth wing, where she exerted her role as a leader in policy formulation, campaigning, street activism, which ultimately led to prison for a few days, and fundraising, using the power of art, music, social media to ensure that the party continued to be a democratic voice for Maldivian youth. In 2020, Shauna was recognized by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. She also happens to be the mother of a 1-year-old child. Please enjoy her presentation. Some of the challenges you What are some of the challenges you identify from your perspective, from your role in addressing the climate change crisis?
If I may, before answering the question directly, I think it'd be appropriate to explain what the situation is in the Maldives. And the Maldives is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And we have been living with climate change for decades. We understand what it is. And for us, it's almost like everyday life for us. For Canadians, it's like the cold weather is everyday life for you. For us, the warm weather, the rain, the ocean, coral reefs, fish, that is what's normal for me. And over the years, even in my lifetime, I have seen changes in weather, changes in coral, how it's being affected, the coral reefs being affected, how our fisheries being affected, everything. So it's really a personal issue for me as well, in terms of addressing the issue of climate change. And I have been working in this since I've graduated in 2008. And I have seen so many things for me to be able to say, what are the things that, what are the challenges that I can identify from my perspective in terms of how we have addressed the climate crisis. First of all, I think we as a global community, we really have failed to agree on emissions reduction. Secondly, we have failed to oversee the mobilization of funds for the most vulnerable countries. And I'll come back to you and explain a little bit about these things. And the multilateral system is very much based on consensus. And this makes addressing climate change a very challenging and a huge task for the UN system as well. And so going back to where we are in terms, what I mean by we have failed to agree on emissions reduction is the latest IPCC report that was just recently released. It clearly states that we really don't have any option but to agree on 1.5 degrees. And by this, what we mean is global temperatures have to be limited to 1.5 degrees. And currently where we are is we're at 1.1. So that means things that we previously thought that could be happening by mid-century, where it's been fast-tracked to the next 2 or 3 decades, which means again, in our lifetime, in your lifetime as well. And we really don't have time. So what we're talking about is we absolutely have to cut down our emissions. We have to agree on 1.5 degrees. That's our #1 failure, because the larger countries, the developed world, and the G20 countries particularly, they are responsible for 75% of the world's emissions. And that's where the problem lies, that we really need to be more sensible. We need to agree on these things, but we have failed. I mean, the latest science again shows that even in 2021, G20's that means the countries that are in G20, their emissions are projected to rise by 5%, and this is not good enough. We are emerging from a global pandemic, which none of us have really seen, which none of us have experienced before. And we say that we are building back better, but evidence really shows otherwise. I personally don't feel like we are building back better. And this rebound, this comeback by the entire world is again fueled by fossil fuels. So we have failed to reduce our emissions. We have failed to reimagine the way we live. We have failed to mobilize funds that are critical for countries like the Maldives to be able to spend on adaptation. What I mean by adaptation is because of global climate change, countries like the Maldives are really undergoing very difficult scenarios. We have, and I can go back to this, what's happening in the Maldives later, but we need urgent funds to be able to spend on for us to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So in short, we have failed to agree on emissions reduction. We have failed to release and oversee the mobilization of funds. We have failed to agree on we have failed to agree that climate change is a reality. It's an emergency, and that's where we have failed.
Thank you, Shauna. And having listed all of those challenges, could you tell us a little more precisely what current impacts you identify in your reality?
As I said, just to give you a little bit perspective, we are about 1,120 islands, and about 187 islands are where Maldivians live. About 150 are tourist resorts. We are the world's 7th largest coral reef system as well. And 80% of our islands are just about a meter above sea level. So when I went to Pearson, for me, it was a completely new environment to see the mountains, to be so high up. We don't have a higher ground like we see in Pearson or in most Canadian cities. So we are a very low-lying country that our protection is based on coral reefs that surrounds our islands. That's our protection, our food, our income, everything is based on our ocean resources and coral reefs. What we have seen, the impact of climate change, is these coral reefs are bleaching. It's dying. And I'm a diver. I scuba dive, I snorkel, I love the ocean. And what I've seen is we don't have, the health of the reefs have really gone down from what it was even just 10 years ago. We don't see the top reef that we used to see anymore. And what happens with this is the coral reefs are home to a lot of diverse marine life. It's home to juvenile fish. It's home to algae and planktons and everything, where basically the fish find home and protection as well. It's also a protection for an island. So when coral bleaches, the health of the reef goes down. And when that happens, what we see is the small fish, they don't have a system where they can depend on to grow and protect themselves. So then it affects the fish population, and we are predominantly also a fishing country, which our economy is based on, and it affects our bait fisheries and food security as well. Secondly, because the coral reefs are dying and because it's been damaged, we have seen increase in coastal erosion as well. I know that over 90% of our islands report shoreline erosion, and that means that we are losing our beach. And because of shoreline erosion, Vegetation is affected by it. The water lens is affected, and there's increased salinity because of that. So none of the islands where Maldivians live, we don't have groundwater which is safe to drink anymore, which is unheard of, because when I went to Canada, it was really a strange thing for me to drink tap water. And you have one of the cleanest groundwater systems, and I think it's such a privilege. And we don't have that. We have to desalinate all the water that we drink, and that is the impact that we are feeling, we are living every day. Thirdly, because we are a tropical country, we have monsoons, which means we get rain in one part of the year. And what we have seen is the severity of our monsoons have increased, and the dry period has been extended as well. So the weather is extremes of both. We get very dry period. We have when it rains, which is not what it used to be. And I speak to a lot of fishermen who tell us that they are no longer able to predict where the bait fisheries are, where the schools are. So because of the changes in weather and the rain, and we are a country that we are the world's most sustainable fisheries. We catch our fish one by one. So pole and line is the only legal way to fish in the Maldives as well. But our fishermen are very skilled, and they depend so much on the weather, rain and wind, and they aren't able to predict these patterns where the fish are migrating and moving. Fourth impact that we see is because of the rain rain pattern has changed so much, we see frequent flooding in the Maldives. So before, when it used to be a gradual process. Now when it rains, it pours, and it rains, and it's really extreme. So the islands aren't able to really take in or the sudden change in temperature, and we see more flooding as well. And it is affecting our agriculture as well. What's happening is because the freshwater lens is being contaminated, and because saltwater intrusion, we don't have the fertility of our soil is being affected as well. And a lot of the islands now report, so we call it the dry period, and we have to supply water to these islands because they run out of water during the dry period. And the issue that we don't usually discuss is how climate change is affecting public health. And again, subtropical diseases such as vector-borne diseases that are spread by mosquitoes, such as dengue, used to be a seasonal thing, but now it's almost everyday life for us. So climate change, how it impacts us on a daily life, it is our food, it is our income, it is our security, and all of these things are being affected. So essentially, climate change is an existential threat for the Maldives.
So Shauna, despite these very real detrimental challenges and impacts, in your current position, in your role as Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Technology, what are some of the opportunities to act effectively?
I mean, the Maldives' contribution to climate change is really negligible. We are a country of about 400,000 people. And despite this, Maldives and even other small island states, they are doing all they can to minimize our emission and to adapt to the changes of climate change as well. We have announced that we have a policy where we are working on to become carbon neutral or net zero by 2030. We have started to implement policies to phase out single-use plastics by 2023. We are working on protecting additional 20% of our ocean resources. We've already protected 13% of our reef area. And so we have all these policies. We are working at a national level to do all we can on minimizing our emissions. Also, we are the first country to be able to quit HCFC. So we no longer use HCFC, which is 10 years ahead of what's stated in the Montreal Protocol. So we are doing what we can and at a national level, but what we do at a national level may not necessarily be, we may not be able to reverse the impacts of climate change. What the most important thing that we need to do is agree on 1.5 degrees, cut down emissions from the most developed countries, where 70% of the world's emissions, G20 countries are responsible for 75% of global emissions. And that's where the problem lies. And that's where the answer should come from as well.
Which leads to the next question and the final one, which is, what do you feel and think that you and other alum, especially in the rest of the world, can do individually and collectively here and now, in or outside the framework of UWC, the UWC movement? What do you feel they could be doing?
Appeal to your governments and appeal to them how important and how urgent the climate emergency is. It may sometimes feel that this is some kind of an issue that's so far away that we may not necessarily feel wherever you are. But I mean, look at what's happening in the world. Look at what happened in Germany. Look at what happened in China. Look at what's happening in Japan, India, United States. Just recently, I mean, I was in UNGA, and just 2 weeks before that, the entire city was flooded. So climate change is no longer just an issue that is affecting small island countries. I feel like it really has breached the front lines, and it's now in the capitals, you know. So don't think of this as, this is not my problem. This is not in my backyard. It really is in your backyard now. So press for 1.5 degrees and press for these issues with your governments. At an individual level, I really think that the fossil fuel carbon dominated world is very much a supply and demand thing as well. So reduce your carbon footprint, reduce your dependence on vehicles and machines powered by fossil fuels, use less, recycle, repurpose. Whatever we use really end up somewhere, and someone is responsible for disposing these things. And climate change, I really think that it's really important to understand that climate change is no longer just a bipartisan issue. It affects us all in the same way. So I think that the most important thing that you can do also really stands at ballot boxes as well. In countries where you have democracy, because I understand that you may not necessarily be able to vote, but impress upon your governments, impress upon your officials, public officials, everywhere, talk about how important it is for us to address climate emergency.
Thank you very much, Shauna, for that. For those of you online, hoping that they're not all listening to me, we will move now to a question period. They will start in the house, in the Max Bell, for questions for Andrew. They will for 5-10 minutes, and finally we will have a chance to ask questions to either Andrew or Lillian from this online group. So if you have
All right,
questions,
awesome. So the way it's going to work, we're going to have 5 questions for Andrew and 5 questions for Lillian, and then some online people will have a chance to ask some questions. So without further ado, if anyone has any questions, we'll just go around popcorn style. Okay, Alice.
Hello, my name is Alice. Okay, my name is Alice Ferguson O'Brien. I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador. And I have a question for Andrew. So I'm from Newfoundland. Yeah. And my question is, like, you obviously, like, it is obvious that we aren't going to meet the 1.5 target. Like, no one's on track to meet it in any ways. But what are we losing when we set our goal to 3 instead of 1.5? Like, what is the reality for like the Maldives, who has an elevation of 5 feet, and
Okay,
like
well,
all those places?
yeah, it's a great question. I feel very sorry for your former alumnus, but the Maldives are in trouble. Look, we know that if you raise sea level by a meter, the Maldives are in huge trouble. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about in the next 100 years or so. So I think this is one of the issues about geopolitical instability that I refer to, is the Maldives are finished. They are. I mean, let's be clear. There's no way we can stop that, because they're the warming will lead to a meter sea level rise. Not a big deal where we are, right? Go check out the beach down here. 1 meter, who cares? Victoria, Labrador, Newfoundland, not really big deal. Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, a bit more of a big deal. Bangladesh, big deal. Shanghai, huge deal. So coming back to that though, one of the reasons why I am frustrated with this 1.5 and 2 degree language is the whole narrative that's been coupled to it, which is we have 12 years left. Where did that number 1.5 come from? Why not 1.5371462? Why not 1.74? There's no science that says 1.5. There's no science that says 2. There's no science that there's 3. What science can tell you is if this warming, then this range of impacts. And as the warming gets more, the range of impacts is more profound and stronger. So what 3 degrees versus 2 degrees? Well, widespread species extinction is going to be something that your generation will have to face. But there's ways of facing that in a means and ways that through the approach of nature-based solutions that people are talking about, through the adaptation corridors. We saw in Guatemala, we were seeing some examples of what they're doing to preserve the jaguars with I mean, there are means and ways that humans can assist in that regard. But really, it's hard to answer that question, because you cannot say with any certainty that 3 degrees will mean 5.64 million people do this. What it will mean is the impacts we see will be greater. So when we talk about the increasing extreme events, they will be bigger. When we talk about increased area burnt from forest fires, they will become more frequent. So it's really, there is no magic number. And that's why I don't like the 1.5, 2, because people are aiming for a number, 12 years left, and it's going to come and go. And then you're going to say, oops, 12 years has passed. We've broken 1.5. Now what? It leads to a sense of hopelessness. It leads to a sense of fear, and it's not productive. What we need to do is eliminate greenhouse gas emissions sooner than later, and go all in to do it, and not worry about what number we're saying. That would be my, I'm sick and tired, honestly, of people promising aspirational reduction targets, because I showed you a figure, they've never been met, except for a few jurisdictions. Like, you will hear, for example, and here's one of my favorite examples, you will hear people say that we'll never deal with global warming unless we deconstruct capitalism, right? You'll hear that. You'll hear people throw other things onto that too. Anybody here from the UK? Gotta have some UK people here. There you go. Okay, stand up and take a bow if you're from the UK. You need to, in front of everybody, because the UK have had 40%, more than 40% emission reductions from 1990 levels already. Think about it, more than 40% emission reductions in the UK. That's because the UK care about this problem. And it's true whether it be a Labour government or whether it be a Conservative government or we be some kind of flipping in between the two with the Scottish National Party and the Lib Democrats. The UK value this, believe this is an important issue, and they've got the support of the people, and they've gone all in. 40% reduction, huge. There's other places like that as well. Canada is tragic. We have been an embarrassment on the international scene, but that is the opportunity, because we have a prime minister now who just got elected. He got elected because of the climate file, not despite the climate file, and that's a big difference. He's going to be leaving a legacy because he is, this is clearly going to be one of his last times. And I think the time in Canada now is we're going to see some really exciting policies come in Canada, in BC in particular. And I would suggest you listen to the news next week, because I wouldn't be surprised to see a whole bunch of announcements coming out of BC next week. So it's, and so I don't worry about the 2 or 3. I worry about let's get on with it, right? Because that focusing on those numbers isn't helpful. I can take off my mask. Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
You have to say where you're from too.
I'm from Quebec, and
Hang on. Quebec is another one where you can take the bow, because Quebec has led Canada up until recently in terms of emissions reductions.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, is there anyone here from Saskatchewan? Hang your head in shame. My parents met in Saskatoon. I love Saskatchewan, but Saskatchewan's emissions are dreadful and have been. But Quebec's always been a leader. Anyway, sorry. Yeah.
As a student, we want to have an positive environmental impact. Is there any career path or academic path that you would recommend?
Yeah, I can tell you with a very high degree of certainty that any career path that you take, you will have influence on this file. And you're probably going, that's not answering my question. But I'm telling you that my answer to the question is, you were sitting here at United World College, Pearson College, with some of the most amazing youth here in the world. And the connections you're going to make and the topics you're going to discuss are going to prepare you, no matter where you go, to be a leader. So I wouldn't worry about that right now. Just enjoy your experience here, because you have no idea how lucky you are. And I've seen that with the people that I hired on the ledge. Like, think about it. There was one MLA, one green MLA on the ledge, and there was 86 other MLAs, but I had 4 UWC staff working with me, 1 green MLA and 4 UWC staff. We were punching way above our weight. We had the NDP feared in this province because of the people I had working with me, and that's because of people like you. So I wouldn't worry about that now. Just do what you enjoy, and just sap up what you got here, because it's going to set you for life. And I'm sure the teachers here will agree with me. And
Awesome.
I didn't go to World College. Can you tell I wish I did? So.
Great. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Okay. I saw Garth's hand a long time ago, so I'm going to run over there. Oh, never mind. Yes.
We also, despite the fact I do note a tinge of silver in the beard, clearly we need to know where you're from, even though you're clearly a teacher.
Okay, so I'm a transplanted New Zealander.
Oh.
So I've been here for a long time.
Well, you have had some coal barons in the past down there, I'll tell you.
Yeah, but at the moment, we don't worry about the coal barons as much as the aggressive farming lobbies.
Yeah.
And as a son of a farmer, I can relate. But we don't have to look too far from New Zealand to see where the coal lobby seems to have puppets in government.
Yes, they do.
And that was the question I was going to ask. And you've given me some hope without any means for it. So
I'm going to give you huge hope on the coal file.
So vested interests versus youth participation and democracy.
Yes.
So yes, the politicians listen to us when there's an election. But then I look at the US and I can see that one senator with big ties to oil and gas is going to hold up a lot of progress there. I look at other countries, our neighbor, where definitely seems to be influenced by the lobby, the mining lobby. And then you look at Davos, where the people elected to represent us hang out with the space cowboy billionaires that you implied some criticism of.
Wasn't
So-
implied, it was direct. Yeah.
Direct,
Yeah.
okay. I was being diplomatic.
There's no implement. Yeah.
So in a way, it's hard to be hopeful, put hope in our politicians because they don't seem to always be listening to us. And I think you would be unique in being one of the few climate scientists who's been actively involved in politics.
Mhm.
I don't know if you went to Davos.
No, I would never go to Davos.
Okay.
I can tell you there's a lot of hypocrisy as well. Flying to Davos, the first thing you should have, like, this is one of the things that really bothers me. I have colleagues who are all getting very excited about the COP meeting and going to the COP meeting. And my comment to them is, why are you going? Like, what are you going to do at the COP meeting? It really isn't about climate. It's about you and your networking and who you want to meet. So there is a bunch of hypocrisy in this. With that said, I'm going to do the hopefulness. In the latest federal election, where you would have seen the various platforms, in December of 2020, the federal Liberals released their platform. Now, I was very critical of when Mr. Trudeau decided to buy Trans Mountain Pipeline, and we could go into that because I don't believe it'll ever get built and we'll never ship anything, but that's another story. But when it came to the plan, one of the key things in that plan is Canada has committed to phase out two things. One is all electricity from coal production by 2030, and all export of thermal coal through our ports as well. And that is important because the US Powder Basin, which is this massive thermal coal deposit, they can't get their coal to market because Washington State has said not through our ports, thank you very much. California has said not through our ports, thank you very much. Oregon has said not through our ports, thank you very much. No more ports in the US on the Pacific. They've been coming through Delta Port down in Swanson, right? But now we've got our feds saying not through our ports as well. So that is actually a really big piece of the pie. And with something like 40% of global emissions coming from coal combustion and producing electricity, it's a big piece of the pie to be dealt with. Vested interests are a problem, and I saw that. LNG Canada, some of you will know, has got a proposal for a facility here in Kitimat. They would lobby extensively when I was there. They came to lobby me, and my response to them was, how do you sleep at night? Honestly, that was what I said when they came to lobby. They didn't like me. But others who were seeking, you know, this is why I talk about solutions. Look how excited the present NDP government is on the innovation file. Look at how excited the feds are on that too. You haven't seen this language being talked about, this opportunity language being talked about. Now it is being talked about because people recognize that in fact, it is an economic opportunity in the transition of our energy systems. So I have been in this business. When I say business, I've been in the climate science field since the 1980s. So most of you weren't even born by then. In fact, many of your parents might not have even been born by then. Not many, some of them. In the early 80s. And for the first time ever, this last federal election, I truly believe that we had a government that got elected with a platform put together by Jonathan Wilkinson, based off our BC platform, that is gold standard. I truly believe that. And I wouldn't give you political BS because I'm not into this. I didn't get into politics to go and, you know, give people what they wanted to hear. I went in there to try to get climate policy in, and we've got it in Canada. We've got it in BC. And watch the announcements next week. I think you'll hear some more from BC. People recognize this now as an opportunity. And I come back to Greta Tunberg. We can't underestimate how influential she has been. When you see grandmas with their grandchildren and grandpas with their grandkids on the legislature lawn, and there's thousands of them, people listen. They really do listen. And it's because they're not the activists. I'm not going to disparage activists, but there is a certain element of our society, I like to call them the rent-a-mob crowd, right? It's the same people demonstrating at the same things. They are actually not influential because you recognize the same faces. It is when you see regular people en masse coming out to these issues, it's a big deal. So you have the politicians know that they cannot now get elected at a national scale or even a provincial scale in BC. You can still in Saskatchewan, but you can't in BC, you can't in Quebec, you can't out in Eastern Canada, you can't in Ontario, you can in Saskatchewan for now, you can in Alberta for now. You get elected unless you have a very aggressive climate plan.
Okay, are there any other questions for Andrew? Okay.
Oh, there's one right there. Very back.
All right. All right. So my name is Viggo from Finland.
Beautiful place. Which
Yeah.
part of Finland?
The archipelago.
Okay, wow.
So you talk a lot about like politics and stuff as a solution and voting and so on.
Yeah.
We also spoke about the tragedy of the commons.
Yes.
And I would argue there that as the meadow depletes, the farmers will innovate in order to make the.
You're talking about free market approach.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So you're saying that the market will solve everything.
Exactly.
So you're saying the market will trump human greed.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, I know. So I would suggest to you that there are many examples in our human history where human greed always trumps market. And the reason why is because we call it a market failure. When the cost of you doing business is action on, when you doing business affects my ability to do business, that is a market failure.
But
It's not a competitive market. If, for example, I am a government and I'm not regulating something and I'm allowing you to, well, here's an example. Really good example. While the role of government is to fix these market failures. Here's an example. Let's suppose I live next to you in my house, okay? And I have garbage in my house and you have a house next to me. You're not as big as me and you're a little bit not well off compared to me. And so what I decide to do is I take my garbage can every day and throw it over the fence, right? I do that every day, whatever. Cost for me is nothing. I'm getting rid of my garbage. But there's no regulation saying I can't. I'm just going to get rid of it onto your lawn. Well, you might not like that. I suspect you won't. And you get upset about that. You might hope that there was some regulatory regime in place to stop me from doing that because my throwing garbage over, there's no rules says I can't. It's a free market. What the heck? But I'm now affecting your livelihood in doing that and you don't like it.
But
So
maybe I'll down talk you to the neighbors and then you'll get a bad reputation, which is from doing it.
So what do I do in response? Do I care? You're a poor person and I'm going to be throwing down this garbage and pretty soon you can't live there. I don't care about you. You have an option. You can't live there because there's so much garbage. What are you going to do? Well, maybe you can move. Maybe you'll just quietly die. Or maybe you'll get angry and fight me back. Or maybe you'll start to badmouth me to my neighbors. So what do? Well, I'm wealthy. I buy a bunch of big burly guys and stick them in my front of the lawn with guns and tell them to stop. And what do? Okay, I'm going to stop and you just go away and quietly die. I mean, the issue I'm pointing out here is there are means and ways of the wealthy and the rich to actually take advantage of market failures at the expense of those who have the inability to take advantage of that. And the role of government is to ensure that the regulatory regime is in place so that market failures are actually corrected. And secondly, to send the signal to the direction of society that as a broader reflection of what broader society want into the direction we want to head.
And I recognize that, but to continue my question, well, basically my question is, how do you see the role of businesses in dealing with these problems that we have here with the...
So there's three solutions. There are three types of solutions: technological, behavioral, and the regulatory or market instruments. And you call that government. Business plays a critical role in this. Of course it does. But let me give an example of where business is unfair. Why is it that we feel it is okay to subsidize? In British Columbia, did you know that British Columbia makes negative amount of money from natural gas royalties? Negative. We actually give away more tax credits than we get in revenue. Now, how is that not an example of gross market manipulation? Because the free market would not allow that. If it was a true free unsubsidized market, natural gas would not be being produced in BC. It's simply too expensive, but it's subsidized. But we don't do that with other areas of our economy. So again, governments have been picking historically winners and losers. That is not free market economy. You go to Alberta, the bastion of so-called capitalism. It is the most egregious example of trying to rig the market to maintain the status quo and actually put in place measures to ensure you don't have a free market compared to any other province. There's no free market in Alberta. It's rigged for the oil and gas sector. You can't compete unless you're actually there, and you have governments who are beholden to them. So I don't buy that we have a free market. It has never been a free market. talk to the people in sub-Saharan Africa. What free market are they exposed to? It may be a free market if you have the ability to do whatever you want and the ability to lobby the politicians to ensure you don't have any regulatory environment put in place so you can continue to do that. Sure, that's a free market for Jeff Bezos and the likes of that. But you and I don't experience that. And so therefore, I would argue it's not free because it's rigged. So it's about internalizing externality to ensure that business is able to compete competitively, but also fairly. And it is that latter, that role that I would argue the government has a critical role to play. In Finland, you have actually a government that recognizes one of the greatest opportunity, and that was through the tech sector. So Finland created a really, really interesting approach to try to focus innovation on its organic growth of its tech sector, whether it be the gaming sector or whether it be, well, other aspects of tech. It's kind of a leader to everybody. They've also did the same thing with the forestry sector. Finland recognized that forestry should be done a different way, not the way we're doing it out here with if it grows, then we cut it down, but in a much more sustainable, well planned out way so that business is thriving in the forest sector. You've got the value added tech stream coming off the forest products. You're doing your forestry in a sustainable way. And you've also recognized that your society is one that can take advantage of the opportunities in the tech sector. So this is about focusing you as a nation on your strategic advantages, but doing it in a manner that actually ensures that externalities are internalized so that the market is a free and fair playing field, because it's not right now, I would argue. That's my so the market, I'm a very much free market guy, but free market has to be free market, not rigged market, in my view.
Hi, yes. Just a question. I come from China, and
You have to say which part of China. That's like saying I come from Canada.
so I come from the northeastern part of China. So basically the province that borders North Korea.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. Formerly Manchuria, regardless.
Manchuria, okay.
Yeah, it's a fun time there.
Yes, you had some very interesting history in Manchuria.
There's so, yeah. But we won't get into history. No. So I'm just sort of curious about
anybody here from Japan? From Japan?
No,
so my Japanese friends out there might want to talk to my Manchurian friends down here, and you can solve the world's problems, right? So no, and why I said that as a joke is I have actually come and visited Pearson. I've come to Pearson and I've seen the most amazing interactions by students from Israel next to students from Palestine, right? This is the kind of interactions you get at Pearson. And I just said that out of a joke, right? So
yeah, it's all forgiven. no.
They're the ones forgiving you. No, you're forgiving them. That's right. Sorry.
No, history is history, yeah. But in the now,
yes.
On politics, I would like to sort of ask a question. In a country that doesn't have democracy, say, for example, China,
yep.
We don't have a democratic system where we can sort of influence the policy-making sort of process.
Your three colleagues behind you are disagreeing with you, I think. No, I'm just...
sort of, do you think that because it is like sort of important for all countries to work towards right limiting or in a sense turning back the effects of climate change or excessive climate change, do you think that international pressure would be the way to push for that?
Well, I'm not worried about China. It sounds weird for me to say that because China is the world's biggest emitter, but the fact that you have that government means that you can do things and turn on a dime. So plastic bags in China. You will recall that one day it was decreed that thou shalt not have plastic bags in China. In China, you can do that and say that, and people have to no longer have plastic bags. Good luck trying to do that in Toronto or Alberta. So one of the benefits, if I can say that, of a benevolent dictatorship. I'm using the word benevolent there, one that's seeking the betterment of good, is you can actually turn on a dime and instrument policies. China is very clearly recognizing the economic opportunity here. They're struggling with a couple of things. They're struggling with the economic growth. There's a bit of a downturn now. They're struggling with some real estate issues, but they also are going all in terms of the new technologies there. In China, for example, you can say, okay, people, this town of several million people, you're going to have to move and we're going to flood you, right? Three Gorges Dam. Good luck. You've been here first year, second year, watch our Site C Peace River. compare the reaction we had in Site C here to the Three Gorges Dam in China. Very different, right? So I'm less worried about the form of government and more concerned about the ability to recognize that this is actually an opportunity too. And I think China, I truly do believe, I know Taiwan, which is, I visited China too. I was quite impressed. Taiwan was ahead of mainland, like they would refer to mainland China or main China, that they went in all early trying to find a strategic niche as a small island state to take advantage of the opportunities. They were like LED light bulbs. So it was one of their things that they went all in on early. And they did well on it. So, so again, I'm not worried about China. I really am not. I'm more worried about the rise of the alt-right and the concerns of the lack of importance of evidence in decision making, the kind of Trumpian QAnon conspiracy stuff. I'm far more worried about that than I am about, say, a kind of government structure whereby you could solve this like that if you wished.
All right, great. So I think that concludes our questions for Andrew. So thank you very much for answering our questions. So due to limited time, we might have to limit our the length of our questions. For Lillian, we'll see if we can we do 3. But Lillian is joining us on Zoom, and so if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask those if she's there. Perfect.
I am here.
Awesome. So does anyone have any questions to begin? Oh, perfect. Beth.
Hi, I'm Beth. I'm from New Brunswick, Canada. And you talked a little bit about like fishery and salmon. And I know in New Brunswick, we had like a really big issue with overfishing. And even in like all the East Coast, we were talking, I had a conversation with some specialists in that field this summer, and they said that like, if we were to imagine an ecosystem that wasn't overfished, like the full bay would be like full of like all these different types of fish and like salmon. So right now we're having an issue where like, because the water source, like the heat is rising, then more salmon are dying and there's less like reproduction going on. So what are some solutions that you can have as like a citizen, which is having some, that is living in an area which are having some problems with like water pollution? How can I make a difference as a citizen, if that makes sense?
Very good question. Thank you for that. Well, you know, fisheries around the world are in distress, really. We work on sustainable fisheries in both in Central America and elsewhere through WWF. And I like David's approach to the responses, you know, to the solutions. Your wallet is important. Regulations are important. So first of all, I think it's really important, whether you're from New Brunswick, from Central America, from Europe or Australia, to understand that fisheries are in distress and the fish that you're consuming has an important footprint, both environmentally and human footprint. I don't know how much you know about that, but a lot of commercialized massive fisheries are produced with human slave labor in some places. And so what can you do? Well, you can be very conscious about how much fish you eat. If you're from New Brunswick and you grew up eating fish, it's a very different concept that if you end up having salmon in Guatemala City for lunch on a weekday. And we need to be conscientious about that. The second thing that you need to know is that not all fish are fished equally. And if you can support local businesses that directly support local livelihoods, it's way better. So question where your product is coming from. Was it shipped? Was it fished and frozen and shipped, you know, from Thailand to reach your grocery, your supermarket, in your home? is an important question that you need to ask. There are sustainable fisheries. There are fisheries around the world that are working on becoming sustainable, and there are labels as a consumer that you can choose, like the Marine Stewardship Council. The Marine Stewardship Council is a responsible fisheries label. You may have heard of the Forestry Stewardship Council. The next time you look at the paper for the copy machine, I guess that you guys don't know what a photocopier is anymore. But anyway, the Forestry Stewardship Council is a label that was created by a group of organizations, including WWF, long time ago, to use as a label on products that were responsibly produced from responsible forestry systems. From that experience of having the FSC label, then came the MSC label, which is the Marine Stewardship Council label. And after that one came the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, which is the ASC label. So when it comes to, sometimes also fish, like I said, will not come from being fished, but from being farmed. And farming fish is not necessarily a step in the right direction. It depends on how you're doing it. So the Aquaculture Stewardship Label Council and the Marine Stewardship Council labels are efforts on the business, on the market, to say this product is more responsible, is more sustainable than the other product. This is going to be more expensive, but the money is making sure that so it is not only about sustainability, but about equity. So the fishermen or the or the aquaculture farmers that are engaged in the process are getting a more dignified livelihood from that than from what the market tells you is the step in the right direction, which is cheaper and more just because consumers can pay for it. I hope that answers your question. You should look at what organizations like WWF may be doing in local fisheries in New Brunswick. Maybe if you go into the WWF website for Canada, they may have some locally based support experiences that they're doing with local fisheries there. Thanks.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, it looks like Jay's got one.
Hi, I'm Jay. I'm from the Philippines, and I'd like to ask, where do we draw the line between livelihood and, like conservatism? And I'm asking this because I know you were talking about how students used to not fly home, and that got me thinking about like how where I'm from in the Philippines, we always have a lot of flights because we are a tourist country, and so I know that like the tourism industry is so like environmentally damaging, but we are still so dependent on it, and it's hard to make change in the country because it contributes to such a large amount of our GDP. So where do we draw the line, or like how do we balance both?
It is a very good question. It's a very, very good question. And I'm not going to tell you that I have all of the answers. Central America is also highly dependent on tourism. But I think that we have to find a balance between the current model for tourism and a more respectful and sustainable model. You can, I don't know if you guys have anyone from Bhutan at the moment. We had a classmate from Bhutan when I was there, and you may know that in Bhutan, the tourism model is very selective. You have to apply to be a tourist, and there's a very limited number of tourists that are allowed in, and they pay for it. They pay a ton of money to go there. So I'm not saying that you have to be incredibly exclusive, but do you really need to open your doors to everyone and anyone? When you do that, your services become cheap, right? They because you're competing and everybody is trying to get the biggest and most incredible experience for the least amount of money. And that ends up hurting the industry and the people that work in it. So, you know, tourism models like the mass tourism, where you have the massive hotel and resort that is built at the expense of the coast, at the expense of mangroves, at the expense of the beach, or at the expense of, you know, a mountainous ecosystem that can be highly eroded when you remove forest cover, and that asks your Filipino citizens to become service providers in a highly competitive industry that doesn't value your specialization, because it's serving a mass tourism that doesn't value that, but values inexpensive services, then you're not getting the best, it's not as cost effective, you're not getting the greatest profit for what you're investing in as a country. So if you can find a balance between slowly phasing out the mass tourism model towards a more community-based, sustainable, equity-based model that receives less tourists, but more quality tourists, and tourists that not only interested in cheap beer and, you know, a beach, but in actually appreciating your culture, appreciating your country, getting to know the place, and feeling that they've arrived in the Philippines rather than in a beautiful hotel that could be anywhere in the world, then you're going to be moving to a more integrated and respectful model.
Great, thank you so much, Lillian. Unfortunately, we are running over time, so we might have to cut the questions there. But thank you so much to our panelists who joined us today, Lillian, Shauna, and Andrew, for answering our questions and giving us their perspectives. So if we could just give them a little round of applause for appreciation.
Thank you, everyone.